Kokias grėsmės prigimtiniams žmogaus teisėms kelia šiuolaikinis globalizmas?
Tai sveiki visi. Gal pirmiausia, aš norėčiau tik atsiprašyti, kad mano iniciatyva buvo sukeisti pranešėjų laikai, tai aš norėjau tik tai parodyti pagarbą, kad užsieniečiai eitų pirmiau, o lietuviškai kalbantis jau eitų ant pačio galo. Tai tik tokia intencija buvo čia sukeisti laikai.
To our guests from abroad, so that they have better time to speak. Well, I could deliver my presentation in English, but I was asked to deliver it in Lithuanian. So that's what I will do. So first of all, thank you so much to the organizers for daring to organize such a conference, however strange it may sound. But these days, speaking up for family values, that could be quite a challenge with realistic social consequences. So congratulations with being brave, dear organizers, and please keep this intention, this energy going, because we have a lot to do, as we've seen based on the previous presentations.
Okay. Tai mano pranešimas yra apie šiuolaikinius politinius iššūkius prigimtiniams žmogaus teisėms. Ir jis bus daugiau apžvelgiamojo pobūdžio, neanalitinio, ir daugiau bus iš politinės sociologijos perspektyvos, iš tos disciplinos aš ateinu. Tai aš pamėginsiu tiesiog apibendrinti šiuolaikinės politinės tendencijas, kurios matomos vakarų pasaulyje, nes jos yra svarbios, net jeigu ir ne visos jos ateina į Lietuvą.
Western world, they're important to us as well, because they will sooner or later reach us. Therefore, we need to know what's going on in the world in order to understand political trends. So maybe, first of all, I should explain the title. What is the contemporary leftist globalism?
Pirmiausia, gal nuo žodžio globalizmas. Kas tas globalistinis?
I worded it. So let's start with the word globalism, what globalistic means and how we should understand globalism per se. So globalism is best seen in the decisions of EU institutions and their political agenda. And it's seen in other decisions that we could name the European Commission, the European Parliament, the European Court of Justice, including, let's say, the International Organization for Migration,
arba Pasaulio ekonomikos forumą, arba Jungtinių tautų pasaulio sveikatos organizaciją. Ir šitų institucijų sprendimuose, šitie sprendimai, jie pirmiausiai nėra priimami kažkokio tai valstybių ar visuomenių dalyvavimo konsensusu. Jie yra priimami tarptautinių institucijų ir jie yra naudojami kaip tam tikro politinio spaudimo instrumentas. Ir kai mes susidurime su šeimos politika, pavyzdžiui, arba su lyties sampratą keičiančiais dokumentais,
issued by these international institutions, we, when looking at such documents, can feel that they are sort of foreign to us. They are not within our political agenda, and actually they are put down on us from the international level. That's the level which is globalistic, and both the academic sources and political analysis specify that this level has issues with democratic accountability. We're not directly electing the members and heads of such institutions, and we do not control them in any way, or at least in the way we control the national level politicians. So one of the globalism key features is that these decisions, international, are provided to us top down, and we cannot influence them neither directly nor through accountability. And it's a key globalism feature which is clearly named as an anti-democratic one, because, as you know, the EU has been suffering for quite some time because of the democratic legitimacy. It's a well-known problem. Globalism is economic as well, and one of the key purposes, which is the top purpose, is the development of a single market, which is economic, or development of the single or domestic or common market. That was the key fundamental for the basis of the EU, and we can see how those European institutions are step by step moving away from this fundamental goal and entering such areas like family policy, human rights, equal opportunities, etc. This problem is not a new one. It's an old one, and we also have Brexit. When the UK exited the EU, which was determined by certain demands of those supranational, international, global institutions on the political system of Britain. And if Hungarians or Brits or we Lithuanians are criticizing the globalistic institutions of the EU, however, we do not criticize the economic fundamentals of EU integration. Because there's a perhaps right consensus that the development of the single market is beneficial for the movement of people, for the businesses, and it's beneficial to all the parties participating. And the UK, when leaving the EU, when Brexiting, it wanted to stay in the economic aspect of the single market, and it wanted to minimize its Brexiting from the economic viewpoint. So the economic fundamentals of the economic integration are good, if I may say so, but political institutions and their decisions already raise some democratic legitimacy problems. Another area where I can see that globalism, this is how I keep explaining the title, namely the globalistic leftism or leftistic globalism. So another area where we can see it is the cultural area, where the key role is played by social media and media in general, just like the entertainment industry. So if we take Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, McDonald's, Amazon, Apple, and other global corporations that are in the top 500 globally, they are the proponents of the provoke ideology. Otherwise speaking, they are supporting the code of new globalism. So the largest economic players, namely companies, media companies, and we used to love Washington Post and New York Times previously, as well as other dailies and magazines, leave alone social media, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, before Musk entered. So these mega companies, mega information channels, including the entertainment industry like Hollywood, like Walt Disney, can be the examples on how they stayed to incorporate the pro-Vogue or pro-LGBT political agenda into their movies. So, having all this field in mind, we can see how the possibilities of political debate are narrowing, how the value-based pluralism is narrowing, and how the platform of traditional viewpoints or pro-family viewpoints is narrowing. It's just narrowing down to the very minimum. So globalism, both economic, political, institutional, and value-based, has acquired certain systematic features, like as mentioned by priest Grigas, but we can see that, irrespective of what is said, there is a certain accord, cultural, political accord, which is international, on what values are desirable and what are not, what are welcome and what are not. So we're facing the global, systematic field of values with a certain features of forced pressure. So why the leftist globalism or globalist leftism? Basically, it has two features or two principles that turn it into leftist or neo-Marxist or progressivist or wokeism. So the first feature of it is aiming for social justice, which is understood as the program of liberating the minorities, animal, migrant rights, LGBT rights, or Black Lives Matter. Otherwise speaking, this emancipationary principle of social justice is clearly Marxistic. It's clearly derived from Marxism, and its ideological identity is clear. However, what Marxism didn't know, but it's another topic which needs ideological analysis, but basically the old Marxism is taken over by new wokeism, new progressivism, because from the labor conflict, which was central to Marxism, we have moved over to the identity policy. That's the difference between the old Marxism and the new progressivism. And the second key feature of leftism as ideology is clearly the support of the role of the global government or government in general. The bigger the role of the government in the emancipation process, the better. The redistribution of good is also supported by the major corporations and globalistic institutions, as we, for instance, have seen during the COVID pandemic. We saw that major amounts were allocated to support businesses. Never before Europe or America did that. 2.3 trillion euros and 1.9 trillion euros in America. So redistribution is supported. And the role of the government as the support of people, the support of businesses during the economic crisis shouldn't deceive us. The redistribution of this good basically does not address the social opposition contradiction. And as it was said by a sociologist from the US, we are living in the new war, under the new war of social classes. Just those classes are different compared to the old time period. Otherwise speaking, we have a new class of globalists. And Mr. Lind, I've mentioned before, is the overclass. He qualifies it as the overclass, which is identified not with the middle income or lower income average Americans, but identifies it to other overclasses from other countries. Otherwise speaking, it is the globalists' class that formed based on capital, etc. And we also see the overclass or globalist social class here in Lithuania as well. It could be identified based on a simple feature. All those NGOs, political parties, organizations, or economic entities, companies living off European money, European funds, which are more of the managerial class that provide services, deliver speeches through contracts. That is the globalist class, representing the leftist vogue or global ideology, or otherwise speaking, global values. So I've just provided it very briefly, provided a very brief overview. I don't know how clear it was, but I'd like to say that the role of the state, of the government, is in a very different context, not the labor and employee and employer capital, but actually the redistribution is good for the globalists. That is why globalists incentivize that new war of the classes, according to Mr. Lind. And of course, the role of the state is attributed usually not to the democratic mechanisms, not through the debate or objective media, in order to debate various contradictory points, namely of homosexual marriages, etc. But it is typical that usually they do something secretly. They're secretive, they try to influence the media and decision makers through non-democratic measures. That means that the power is used non-democratically, and perhaps in terms of media, we have the channel LRT, which is the state national media provider, media broadcast, and they're very biased. They receive more than 60 million euros per year. However, they do not represent the value expectations of the majority, just the opposite. They form that very biased political agenda. And the LRT channel is the best globalism example in Lithuania, including the so-called Lithuanian conservative parties. So that leftist trend to give a high emancipatory role to the governments both in Lithuania and other countries is basically turning into the political and social dominance. It is not the implementation of the social justice, it is just pushing on the political will, anti-democratic political will onto others, instead of the incentivizing the discussion on political values. There are no discussions. There are certain political agendas pushed over. I'd like to add option number 3, more on my own behalf, in order to explain what is that leftist globalism and how leftism is reflected in globalism. The third aspect is, or option, is censorship. I've already mentioned about pushing on political will, pushing political will onto somebody, but however, Marxism had a very similar mentality because it couldn't coexist with the opposing ideologies, because all the opposing ideologies were understood as the instrument of domination field directed against the minorities, therefore they had to be fighted against. Therefore, Marxism is not a political theory. It is more the ideology of political action, because you can still discuss with a political theory, you can still find some basis for understanding. However, what we see in the classical old Marxism and in the globalistic leftism, we simply see domination and removal of opponents and simply fight what they liked to do, what they liked since the very beginning. And for Marxism, just as for the leftist globalism, well, they have that Lenin's mentality typical to both of them, who is guilty and whom to punish. So that is the political mentality leading directly to the political censorship. That much about leftist globalism, about as a phenomenon, why it's global, because it's the institutional, global, economic, political, cultural, etc. And why is it global? Because it includes emancipation, censorship, and emancipation. And I'd like to also mention another term which is confusing. That is liberal left. From the US context, we have that concept of liberal left. How could we explain it? It is quite a misleading term, I mean the liberal left term. Allegedly, liberal means liberals, and such concepts are sort of associated to a freer view to euthanasia, drugs, immigration, abortions. It's sort of associated with a freer, open-minded viewpoint to current phenomena. So allegedly it's liberalism. Allegedly, everybody's accepted and love will win, as they love to say in this context. However, we should say that no liberalism could be found here, because classic liberalism defended an individual's autonomy against the violence or coercion, compulsion. However, leftist this liberalism, which is modern, is using secretive decision pushing, political decision pushing, all anti-democratic mechanisms, so that liberal left doesn't have much anything tangible about. And previously in America, we would see conservative analysts who would use liberal lefts or leftists or liberals, and now another term, namely communist, is more widespread. And it's very strange to see this word as namely communist in America in the 21st century, while America had no communism there. And just as Priest Grigas mentioned in his introductory statement, that we are making this historical turn of the circle, that what we saw back in the Soviet time, we can see it reflected in the 21st century, namely the relationship between the citizens and the government as under the free formation. So I hope I've managed to explain to a certain extent that leftist globalism, even though the very words are not determining. The most important thing is the content of their political program, what they propose. Now I'd like to move to part 2 on trends in the Western world that can be seen and that are already a concern in terms of human rights. And we see really a lot of that. So, compulsion,
beprecedentis lyties ir šeimos performulavimas.
So first of all, we see the unprecedented rewording of sex, gender, family. The words are the same, however, the content of those words are very different now. And how we should understand that rewording? We see that we have a difference from the classical epoch, old Greek, Roman, and Christianity, and their natural human rights dominated by the natural values to the human rights that are based on human self-expression. And I don't know if it's very popular, but there is a big difference in the content between the old and the new human rights. The new human rights are based not on the nature, but on the self-expression of a human being, as well as the identity. Therefore, they're qualified as identity rights, but not the natural human rights. And the concept of human being is reworded so that it's no longer clear what's a man, what's a woman, and even such perversions are promoted, like birth-giving men, and that there are 60-year-olds that treat themselves as babies. Because I had a brief conversation with a British psychotherapist who said that there is a new psychotherapy type emerging, because she's consulting people who trauma treatment is based on going back to the childhood. So she dresses them like babies, bathes them like babies. These are her patients who are 50 or 60-year-olds. And this is the method of transgression. She has tons of customers, they're queuing to get her services, and people go back to their childhood, and when they do that, their bad impressions are replaced by positive ones. How maybe that's good, but actually such phenomena like changing the gender of children and birth-giving men and multiple identities. You can read Brown and see how many sexual identities could be there. But it's not good because actually there's no difference whether there are 5 genders or, sorry, 5 sexes or sexual identities or 72, but it's not natural anymore. Therefore, transgenderism not only rewards the concepts of the family and sexual identity, but it also washes out the human nature and dips us into political and social discussions that have no meaning, because if it's not clear what family is and sexual identity is, what kind of discussions could be had. And there's another point I wouldn't like to digress to, but I'd like to say that among those leftists, they believe that maybe these are perversions, but let's keep the homosexual marriages and such perversions as birth-giving men, they are marginal, we will never acknowledge them, etc., etc. But, you know, can't do that. You can't say that and have this concept, because the American public Supreme Court passed the decision enforcing same-sex marriage, but actually many justices say that if the person is free, we cannot limit his or her choice whom to live with. But it's worth reading the dissenting opinions of justices, mentioning one serious argument, namely that if we remove the family and the sexual identity from the natural aspect of the human being, and then there are no limits whatsoever to recognizing zoophilia, polygamy, etc. And these are very serious arguments by the Supreme Court justices. So we cannot simply recognize one transgenderism aspect, but not others. And if we disconnect the natural, nature of the man from its sexual identity and family, then we open the gate to treat to interpret things very differently. So the first challenge to human rights is the rewording of the sexual identity and family. That is the key thing, the creme of the creme, because if we reword these concepts, then we do not know the limits of that freedom rippling out, and those limits do not exist. That's the key major challenge.
Okay, my presentation is the last one. Please stop me. So the second challenge in terms of human rights, by the way, I would like to come back to the first one, to the first challenge. I'd like to highlight that the reformulation of gender of the new human rights are of a narcissistic nature. I mean that constitutional values and rights as a self-expression, they've turned out into a simple consumption manifestation of own gender, of identity. And here there was one slide presented by Paul Sullins. Only 14% of gay couples are ready, are prepared to raise children. What does this mean? That they are narcissistic, that they have, these couples have no concept of parenthood. They are determined by sexual things, not by the natural rights or children raising. Only 14%. Or women lesbian, 29%, 1/3. So this is a perfect example of narcissism. Everything is about myself, about my sexual requirements or requests or needs, not about the commitment to the children. Erich Fromm, a very famous philosopher of the beginning of the 20th century, to be or to have. A narcissist will always say, I want to have this or that. And Fromm suggested, I want to be a good friend, not to have children, but to be a good father. So Fromm's separation between to be and to have, so is a perfect example. So now the second major challenge or political trend on what we see in the post-Soviet space, what is shocking, it is the censorship in America and range and in America, in our countries, we do remember that during the societies, during our independence movement, we went to Europe, we returned to Europe, to the space of security, freedom, especially freedom. We didn't have freedom in the Soviet Union. We sought for freedom. What we see now, the censorship, the level of censorship in the European Union, in the world, is huge. The freedom of speech is restricted, the freedom of conscience, convictions, beliefs, religious communities are restricted. We have in our constitution separate articles guaranteeing these rights. What are the actual challenges with respect to censorship? It is expressed in social characteristics. For example, censorship, what we see in social media, in social networks, it is based on social processes. For example, 30%, according to surveys, 30% of young Americans, they do not think that the First Amendment is not changeable. They do not think that this amendment is, they do agree that it is a must to restrict a freedom of speech. And if it is a hate speech, and when in Lithuania, when we have political discussions on whether we have to criminalize the hate speech, there is no doubt the hate speech is a quality of leftist speech. There are no doubts. So more than 30% of young Americans are ready to restrict freedom of speech for the sake of the hate speech. What do they have in mind by hate speech? So quite a lot of this hate speech are normal conservative values. If you are for the family rights, if you are for classical liberalism, you can easily be written off to the hate speech, easily. We see the litigation processes, we see the cases against priests, Chris Baker case, for example, in 2018, when a baker in Colorado State, he refused to bake a cake for the gay a couple, and he was sued and reached even the Supreme Court. And this is not the only case. Photographers are persecuted, service providers are persecuted. So the rights of religious communities are on the verge, or are under huge pressure. So now regarding censorship, there are youth trends and there are trends of the academic world. More than 90% of university professors are of leftists. How to work in the Western world university for a leftist global approach consensus is prevailing today in Lithuania as well. And if a professor does not meet the requirements of university, he is marginalized by not openly saying what is the problem. So, in short, censorship has a social basis. It comes from the changes of social values, and it is expressed through the policy of social networks and media. The American Congress has had a set of hearings, invited Twitter authorities, Facebook authorities, were blamed for the biased opinion. So leftist globalism is related to open censorship. And what can we add to the fact that Facebook eliminated, deleted the account of the American president? The American president was suspended. So what about us, ordinary people? So now, okay, of course, cancel coach recognized phenomena in Lithuania recently, but it's not a culture. This is anti-culture, social pressures. It is the same censorship, but carried out not by political institutions or, for example, by the private sector. So this is a crowd authority, and it is a challenge to freedom of speech. Cancel culture is nothing but undermining the constitutional rights. It cannot be called culture, but we have such a concept, and you know it very well. Violations of children's rights. Having in mind, for example, the Norway and the system of children's rights in Norway, which is highly commercialized, and having in mind Lithuanian events when we adopted a new law on children's rights, I make a conclusion that progressivist children's rights are violation of children's rights. The institutions which should defend children's rights, they are violating children's rights. So the child is materialized, kind of. The state violates the natural family concept, and the state interferes and drastically interferes into the family matters. And the majority Western countries have similar children's rights concept and system to that of the Norwegian. So not only the concept of family is being diminished, but also the children's rights concept is being diminished. I don't remember whose presentation was it, that family has been always treated as a pre-political, that it is earlier than politics. It is a natural thing that this sphere should be protected by the state. Hobbes, Rousseau, Montesquieu, social contracts, that the state should be stopped to the natural human rights, fundamental rights. And if the state interferes, the standard of security should be very, very, very high on whether the state really needs to interfere, only in exceptional cases. So Norwegian model is characteristic of many Western countries. So this here in Norway and other countries, the state can easily interfere into the family. But if we speak about the natural relations, it is I'm sorry. So the stronger is the natural concept, the more liberalism is stronger, and the state is less interfering into the family matters. Now, the violations of children's rights. Sexualization, and we could see that in the resolutions of the European Parliament promoting the sexual cognition of the baby age, if I translate it right. There are education programs which explain genderism, propagate genderism. And colleague from Hungary also said about drag queen show in America. We do not have this in Lithuania, but I think that it will come soon to our country as well. Transgenderism is never a matter of adults. It also brought down to children. And what we could say, and they managed to do that, and it has social, responses. And according to the statistical data, LGBT people, since from 40 to 70, there is only one objective, and the people of 19, 26, 20%, they attribute themselves to LGBT. A huge difference. So mass sexualization not related to older people, but young people, 20-year-olds, every fifth American citizen identify themselves as LGBT representatives. Now, violations of children's rights, sexualization, I mentioned that, and I could attribute it to the violation of children's rights. Yes, definitely. Here we will not solve this problem. It needs huge discussions and debates. Now, violation of parents' rights, constitutional rights. I already mentioned that the children are easily taken from the parents' care, and the violations of parents' rights usually are related to the education system. In Florida state, 1 week ago, as far as I know, adopted a law, and the governor of Florida signed the law prohibiting dissemination or spread diversity, inclusion, equity, and gender equality ideas in Florida state's finance schools. In private schools, that's okay, but in public schools, no. Montana state, as far as I know, also has discussed this issue. Religious communities and their freedoms. A quote of the Bible could serve as a basis to defend the principles of the Bible. Could also they go in confrontation with the new leftist globalism. We could see from the court processes. We could see that in many areas of our life. A very famous letter to the Apple employees when they felt the pressure LGBTism, and they said that they faced huge pressure with regard to their religious beliefs. Now, the nation's demographic right global institutions' decisions today in this era have very often anti-democratic nature. I don't think that Lithuanians voting in Euro referendum or during the freedom, independence movement, they could sign the same program which is being promoted today. The European institutions say that their directives, their decisions are more important than national constitutions. Constitutional or Supreme Courts do not agree with this. There is no such a supremacy principle. This principle of supremacy has been derived from the European Court of Justice doctrines, but and one of the last issues, elitism related to globalism. Elitism, this is kind of a political, social situation in the country when political decision makers does not react, does not respond, or goes against the majority, against the society, against the majority of the society. And this elitism could be discerned in the decision of the major or propaganda in censorship in many institutions. In America, people in America, in Lithuania and in other Western countries, they feel strangers in their own countries. So you couldn't find a better definition of elitism. The ship of the state is directed by someone, somewhere, but not by the state's people, not by the public. One could say that this is kind of a populism, that populist parties want to represent the will of the nation, but this is true, but this is an actual truth based on sociological surveys. Political decisions do not comply with the will of the majority, and elitism is blossoming at the political decision-making, political party level. And we also have a new social war. Elitism can be physically even, felt. Global elites defend their situation, their economical situation. Therefore, they need immigrants because the locals, because immigrants will work they are a cheap labor, so they speak for the open immigration. And one of the explanations could be, and finally, the challenge to the property and security. We could see that from various protests in America, from the immigration crisis, unimaginable changes in the security and property institutions. I would like to remind you that both security and property, this is the essence of classical constitutionalism, life, liberty, and property. So property is one of the central, security one of the central elements in the human rights system. What we see today, via protests, riots in America, we could see that property concept is changing. Damaging of property, rooting of property, it is attributed as a constitutional right of the Americans to protest. So the property is not protected anymore by the state, because although it is the duty of the state. What did we see in 2015 during the immigration crisis in Europe? We can see that immigration is not regulated anymore. Even security institutions are concerned that it's dangerous to the state's security. But Angela Merkel's government didn't regulate this process. So, to conclude, we need to follow these trends. We need to follow these tendencies. Leftist globalism, what does it bring? It brings a modern constitutional contract reformulation. We literally move to a new paradigm system. And the human rights, the fundamental human rights, they become different. They differ. They acquire a new content. Property is not the property anymore as and we can recall the World Economic Forum. So when literally it was said that property is kind of the source of pollution, you will not have anything, but you will be happy. You know the saying. So the property is reformulated, gender is reformulated, the gender is reformulated, immigrants are provided, you know, various opportunities which are taken from locals. To my mind, little by little, the Western world moves to a different social contract. But this social contract is being written by the elite via Istanbul Conventions, by Global Migration Pact of 2018. And this kind of programs a new conflict, because we are moving toward new constitutional legal paradigm. Our old human rights are disappearing, and at the same time we move to a new political conflict. Nobody can imagine its consequences, but some features remind of barbarian. My hypothesis would be as follows. The old contract, it protected, effectively defended from barbarism, it defended security, individual rights, it protected the natural rights, but the current paradigm, it doesn't so far suggest any new forms, only destruction, but maybe we are returning back to a super modern barbarian times, barbarism. So, post-Soviet transformations and the ideologies I've been speaking about. We are all in the post-Soviet space. When we had this transformation, the academic literature described it as a road towards a single market, to a better democracy, the road to a more political responsibility, more freedom, and yes, we moved toward that, but other scientists forecasted one more trend, that collapse of Soviet structures and movement towards free market, single market, capitalist system, in certain cases, especially in Russia, brought to regress, to barter exchange. What I would like to say by this analogy, not everything what is presented or explained that is progressive, good, you will have more freedom, more love, and love will win. But this process
jisai kaip ir tos
might
apraiškos bus
be the
regreso,
opposite.
bus grįžimas
It
į
might
tam
mean
tikrą naują
regress
barbarybės formą.
or return
Ir ar
to
tik
a
nereikės
certain
grįžti prie to
thought
tradicinio gerojo
of barbarism.
konstitucionalizmo, kuris ir apsaugojo nuo religinių
We
karų
need to
16
think about
amžiuje
that.
tos barbarybės. Ir įtvirtino tai, ką mes šiandien žinom kaip prigimtinės žmogaus teisės. Klausimas atviras.
So this is an
Sekime
open
naujienas.
question.
Iki naujų
Let's
susitikimų.
follow the news, and I expect to see you again soon.
Andriau, nepabėk, nes dar diskusija.